A quiet dinner turns into a nightmare and a racist gang attacks an unsuspecting man. But what they don't know is that their target is no ordinary person. Gregory, an overweight black man, isn't just a victim, he's a former CIA agent with skills and secrets that could destroy them all. Just when things seem their darkest, an unexpected ally emerges, and Gregory is forced to confront a past he thought he had escaped. What happens when your deepest secrets resurface, and enemies you can't outrun close in on you? How far would you go to protect yourself from a past that refuses to stay buried? Drop your thoughts below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share for more. This story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. It was a crisp evening in downtown Brooklyn. The kind of night where the city's pulse quickened with every passing car, every honking horn, and every shout that echoed off the brick buildings. But inside the dimly lit restaurant, a quiet dinner was unfolding, at least for now. Gregory James sat alone at a corner booth, his large frame filling the seat comfortably. He was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and weighed well over 300 pounds. The soft, flickering candle on the table was the only source of light, casting shadows over his strong, weathered face. His hands, resting on the table, looked like they could crush a man's throat with ease if need be. Yet, he wasn't a man of violence anymore. Not in the traditional sense. He had retired from the one thing he was once so good at, being a covert operative for the CIA. His life now was about simplicity, peace, quiet, and good food. He had found solace in the mundane, hoping that his past wouldn't follow him here. Gregory's meal had arrived, and he was about to take the first bite of his ribeye steak when a raucous group of men entered the restaurant. They were loud, obnoxious, and clearly intoxicated, their presence immediately causing a disturbance. They were a gang, 5 of them, wearing leather jackets with skull insignias. Their eyes roamed the room arrogantly, as if they owned it. Gregory glanced up but quickly returned his attention to his food. He had no time for trouble. It was just another night. But then, one of the men, tall, with a scruffy beard and a cruel smile, spotted him. Well, the man sneered, striding towards Gregory's booth with his friends trailing behind him. Looks like we got ourselves a little dinner date. A big guy like you, sitting here alone, just asking for some company. Gregory didn't respond. He wasn't one for confrontation. Not anymore. The man leaned over the table, looking down at Gregory with contempt. What's a big fella like you doing here, huh? You some kind of loser? Or maybe you're one of those people who think they can just eat their meal in peace, away from real men like us. His voice was dripping with sarcasm. Gregory stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the man's face, calculating, analyzing every move. He wasn't afraid, but he knew how these situations usually played out. The best course of action was to de-escalate. But the man wasn't having it. You deaf, fat ass? He shouted, slamming his hand onto the table. The candle flickered wildly as the group of thugs laughed behind him. I'm talking to you. Gregory's fingers tightened slightly around his knife. He hadn't planned on getting involved in a fight, not in this state of life, but something about this man's attitude irked him. He had spent his years in the CIA taking down enemies who thought they could intimidate others. This wasn't much different. Maybe you should take a seat, Gregory said, his voice calm and steady, but there was a hint of authority in it. Before you make a mistake. The gang leader's smile faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. Oh, so you think you can boss us around now, huh? Just because you're big and scary? He turned to his gang, laughing mockingly. He thinks he's tough. You've had your fun, Gregory said, his voice low. Now, go sit down and leave me in peace. The gang leader was now visibly annoyed, his face turning red. Fat ass wants peace, huh? Maybe I'll give you some peace of mind, on the floor. Before Gregory could react, the man grabbed the back of the booth and shoved it hard, sending the table sliding back with a screech. The other members of the gang crowded around, snickering and egging him on. Gregory's chair tipped slightly, but he remained calm, his hands steady. He wasn't going to let this escalate, but he wasn't going to back down either. Without warning, one of the thugs reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade. He flicked it open with a snap, the blade gleaming under the dim lights. I think it's time to teach you some manners, buddy, the thug snarled, advancing on Gregory. Gregory's muscles tensed, but he didn't move. He knew this would get violent, but he wasn't worried. He had been in worse situations before, much worse, enough. Gregory said, his voice now colder. Walk away. The thug, undeterred, lunged forward, slashing at Gregory with the knife. Gregory's reflexes kicked in. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the thug's wrist, twisting it until the man yelped in pain. The blade clattered to the floor. Gregory shoved the thug back with surprising strength, sending him crashing into a nearby table, knocking over drinks and plates. The other members of the gang drew weapons, 2 pulled guns, 1 held a metal pipe, and another had a crowbar. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted instantly. The clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation stopped. Everyone in the restaurant was now watching the scene unfold. Gregory stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room and assessing his opponents. He wasn't just some overweight guy at a dinner. He wasn't just a man enjoying a quiet meal. He was someone trained to survive, to think fast, and to act decisively. The years of CIA training weren't something you just forgot. One of the thugs with a gun aimed it at Gregory's chest. "You're gonna regret this," he said with a sneer, his finger twitching on the trigger. Gregory's expression hardened. With lightning speed, he grabbed a bottle of wine from the table and hurled it directly at the thug's face. The bottle exploded on impact, and the thug staggered back, momentarily stunned. Before the others could react, Gregory lunged at the nearest man holding the crowbar, knocking it out of his hands and slamming his fist into the thug's ribs. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the restaurant. But Gregory was already in motion, ducking behind a pillar and rolling to the side. He drew a gun of his own, hidden in a waistband holster, and fired off a shot. The thug with the metal pipe collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain. The gang was losing control fast. But Gregory knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was about to begin. The room was a chaotic blur of movement. Chairs screeched across the floor, men shouted, and glass shattered as the gang members scrambled to regain control. Blood dripped from the thug with the crowbar, his face twisted in pain, but his eyes burned with rage. Gregory, his breath steady, his stance firm, was already in full control of the situation. The thug with the gun who had just shot was still dazed, holding his bloodied face as he tried to steady himself. Gregory's bullet had grazed his cheek, but it had been enough to send him stumbling back into the corner, cowering behind a table. The thug with the knife, now recovering from Gregory's quick disarm, lunged forward with a scream. Desperate to land a blow, but Gregory was too fast. He sidestepped and slammed the thug into the wall with a heavy thud, his shoulder digging into the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The thug crumpled to the ground, groaning. His knife lay forgotten a few feet away. The remaining 2 gang members, one with the crowbar and the other still holding the pipe, sized Gregory up from the other side of the restaurant. They had clearly underestimated him. Their eyes flicked between each other, calculating. One of them made a split-second decision. He wasn't about to die tonight, not for a gang that had already lost the upper hand. "You're done, fat ass." The thug with the crowbar yelled, charging at Gregory with reckless abandon. Gregory, eyes narrow, dropped low, using the thug's momentum against him. As the crowbar swung through the air, Gregory dodged and grabbed the man's outstretched arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground with a sickening crack. The thug howled in pain, but Gregory wasn't done. He pinned the thug to the floor, his massive weight pressing down on the man's chest, effectively rendering him useless. Meanwhile, the last thug with the metal pipe hesitated. His hands trembled as he eyed Gregory, calculating his chances. He wasn't a fighter. He was a street thug, someone who used fear and intimidation to get what he wanted. But the man he faced now was far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. Gregory's expression was as cold as stone. He had no time for games, no time to waste. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small tactical knife, flipping it open with a snap. The thug's eyes widened. "No. No, please." The man begged, stepping back. We don't have to do this. We were just messing with you, man. Come on, no need for any more blood." Gregory didn't blink. "It's too late for that." Before the thug could react, Gregory launched himself forward, closing the gap between them in mere seconds. He grabbed the thug's wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the pipe. The thug screamed in agony. But the sound was quickly cut off as Gregory slammed the heel of his boot into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. The thug collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, but Gregory wasn't finished. He grabbed the man by the collar, hoisting him into the air, and snarled, "You'll leave here alive, but you'll remember this night for the rest of your life." The thug, now terrified, nodded desperately. Gregory dropped him unceremoniously to the floor, turning his attention back to the rest of the gang. The once proud gang was now a broken shell. 3 of their members lay on the floor, incapacitated or writhing in pain. The thug with the gun was still recovering, clutching his cheek where Gregory's bullet had grazed him. He didn't know whether to fight or run, and that hesitation was enough for Gregory to take control of the situation. Gregory turned to the terrified man who had held the pipe and pulled his jacket open, revealing his CIA-issued weapon. The sleek black gun gleamed in the light. The thug's eyes widened, but before he could say anything, Gregory's voice was a low growl, "Take your friends and leave. Now." The remaining gang members, now reduced to just 2, looked at each other, exchanging nervous glances. They had come to this restaurant thinking they could intimidate anyone. But the sight of Gregory, towering over them, was enough to crush any further thoughts of aggression. The thug with the gun, still holding his bleeding cheek, was the first to scramble to his feet. He was shaking, but he knew that this was not a fight they could win. He turned to his comrades, nodding sharply, and they made a hasty retreat toward the door, leaving their fallen friends behind. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the restaurant as they fled into the night. A few seconds passed before Gregory's breathing returned to normal. He stood still, his gun lowered, but his muscles still tense, ready for anything. The silence in the room was deafening. The restaurant had gone from chaos to complete stillness. The patrons who had been watching the spectacle in fear now turned their attention back to their unfinished meals. Unsure of what they had just witnessed. They'd seen a man defend himself, but they didn't understand the full picture. Gregory looked down at the gang members lying in front of him, but his thoughts weren't on them. His mind drifted back to the days he had spent in the CIA, training, missions, and endless danger. That life had left its mark on him. But now, here he was, sitting at a dinner table, fighting for his life like any other man. He had chosen peace, and for a moment, it seemed like the world was determined to take that away from him. He shook his head, trying to refocus. This wasn't the life he wanted, but the world seemed to keep pulling him back into the fight, but he wasn't done yet. He wasn't just some overweight man. He wasn't just a civilian. He had a past that no one could touch. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. He looked down at the screen, and his expression hardened. It was a message. A number he didn't recognize, but the content was clear. "We know who you are, Gregory. This isn't over." His hand clenched into a fist, the reality of the situation setting in. The past, it seemed, had come calling. The room was a chaotic blur of movement. Chairs screeched across the floor, men shouted, and glass shattered as the gang members scrambled to regain control. Blood dripped from the thug with the crowbar, his face twisted in pain, but his eyes burned with rage. Gregory, his breath steady, his stance firm, was already in full control of the situation. The thug with the gun who had just shot was still dazed, holding his bloodied face as he tried to steady himself. Gregory's bullet had grazed his cheek, but it had been enough to send him stumbling back into the corner, cowering behind a table. The thug with the knife, now recovering from Gregory's quick disarm, lunged forward with a scream. Desperate to land a blow, but Gregory was too fast. He sidestepped and slammed the thug into the wall with a heavy thud, his shoulder digging into the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The thug crumpled to the ground, groaning. His knife lay forgotten a few feet away. The remaining 2 gang members, one with the crowbar and the other still holding the pipe, sized Gregory up from the other side of the restaurant. They had clearly underestimated him. Their eyes flicked between each other, calculating. One of them made a split-second decision. He wasn't about to die tonight, not for a gang that had already lost the upper hand. "You're done, fat ass." The thug with the crowbar yelled, charging at Gregory with reckless abandon. Gregory, eyes narrow, dropped low, using the thug's momentum against him. As the crowbar swung through the air, Gregory dodged and grabbed the man's outstretched arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground with a sickening crack. The thug howled in pain, but Gregory wasn't done. He pinned the thug to the floor, his massive weight pressing down on the man's chest, effectively rendering him useless. Meanwhile, the last thug with the metal pipe hesitated. His hands trembled as he eyed Gregory, calculating his chances. He wasn't a fighter. He was a street thug, someone who used fear and intimidation to get what he wanted. But the man he faced now was far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. Gregory's expression was as cold as stone. He had no time for games, no time to waste. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small tactical knife, flipping it open with a snap. The thug's eyes widened. No. No, please. The man begged, stepping back. We don't have to do this. We were just messing with you, man. Come on, no need for any more blood. Gregory didn't blink. It's too late for that. Before the thug could react, Gregory launched himself forward, closing the gap between them in mere seconds. He grabbed the thug's wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the pipe. The thug screamed in agony. But the sound was quickly cut off as Gregory slammed the heel of his boot into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. The thug collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, but Gregory wasn't finished. He grabbed the man by the collar, hoisting him into the air, and snarled, "You'll leave here alive, but you'll remember this night for the rest of your life." The thug, now terrified, nodded desperately. Gregory dropped him unceremoniously to the floor, turning his attention back to the rest of the gang. The once proud gang was now a broken shell. 3 of their members lay on the floor, incapacitated or writhing in pain. The thug with the gun was still recovering, clutching his cheek where Gregory's bullet had grazed him. He didn't know whether to fight or run, and that hesitation was enough for Gregory to take control of the situation. Gregory turned to the terrified man who had held the pipe and pulled his jacket open, revealing his CIA-issued weapon. The sleek black gun gleamed in the light. The thug's eyes widened, but before he could say anything, Gregory's voice was a low growl, "Take your friends and leave. Now." The remaining gang members, now reduced to just 2, looked at each other, exchanging nervous glances. They had come to this restaurant thinking they could intimidate anyone. But the sight of Gregory, towering over them, was enough to crush any further thoughts of aggression. The thug with the gun, still holding his bleeding cheek, was the first to scramble to his feet. He was shaking, but he knew that this was not a fight they could win. He turned to his comrades, nodding sharply, and they made a hasty retreat toward the door, leaving their fallen friends behind. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the restaurant as they fled into the night. A few seconds passed before Gregory's breathing returned to normal. He stood still, his gun lowered, but his muscles still tense, ready for anything. The silence in the room was deafening. The restaurant had gone from chaos to complete stillness. The patrons who had been watching the spectacle in fear now turned their attention back to their unfinished meals. Unsure of what they had just witnessed. They'd seen a man defend himself, but they didn't understand the full picture. Gregory looked down at the gang members lying in front of him, but his thoughts weren't on them. His mind drifted back to the days he had spent in the CIA, training, missions, and endless danger. That life had left its mark on him. But now, here he was, sitting at a dinner table, fighting for his life like any other man. He had chosen peace, and for a moment, it seemed like the world was determined to take that away from him. He shook his head, trying to refocus. This wasn't the life he wanted, but the world seemed to keep pulling him back into the fight, but he wasn't done yet. He wasn't just some overweight man. He wasn't just a civilian. He had a past that no one could touch. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. He looked down at the screen, and his expression hardened. It was a message. A number he didn't recognize, but the content was clear. "We know who you are, Gregory. This isn't over." His hand clenched into a fist, the reality of the situation setting in. The past, it seemed, had come calling. The silence of the restaurant hung thick in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Gregory's heart rate began to slow, but the message on his phone gnawed at him. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment longer, as if waiting for some sort of revelation, some explanation for who could possibly know about his past. He had kept a low profile for years, no ties to his former life, no records, nothing to suggest he was once a covert CIA agent with a history written in blood. He glanced up at the other diners, their eyes still wide, some of them frozen in disbelief, others staring at the remnants of the destruction the gang had left behind. No one dared speak. No one dared to move. A man like Gregory, having taken down the entire gang by himself, was not someone anyone wanted to test. His reputation in the shadows of his past had made him as dangerous as anyone in this room could imagine. Gregory's gaze shifted back to the phone in his hand. The message was simple, but it was a warning. Whoever these people were, they weren't here to play. He was no longer safe. He felt the old instincts bubbling up, those trained reflexes that had kept him alive for so many years. As much as he hated to admit it, he knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. The sounds of the restaurant slowly began to return to normal as the tension in the air began to dissipate. A server, who had been hiding behind the bar, cautiously approached the table where Gregory sat, his hands visibly shaking. "Sir, are you all right?" The server's voice trembled, his eyes flicking nervously between Gregory and the unconscious men sprawled across the floor. Gregory didn't answer immediately. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, and his mind was elsewhere. He ran his hand over his face, exhaling deeply. This was not how his night was supposed to go. He had expected a quiet meal, a moment to relax, to reclaim a piece of the life he had worked so hard to build after his years in the CIA. But it seemed the shadows of his past had a way of following him. "I'm fine," Gregory muttered, his voice flat. He stood, slipping the phone into his pocket and adjusting his jacket. "But I think it's best you call the police. The thugs in this place won't be a problem anymore." The server nodded quickly, almost too eager to comply, and hurried off to the back of the restaurant. Gregory watched him go, his mind already planning his next steps. He couldn't stay here, not with that message hanging over him. Someone knew who he was, and that meant someone was coming for him. As he turned to leave, his eyes flicked to the gang members scattered across the floor. They had made a grave mistake attacking him, but the one thing he couldn't ignore was their sudden disappearance. The thought of them regrouping, licking their wounds, and coming back with reinforcements worried him. If they had been hired by someone with enough pull, they wouldn't be the only threat he'd have to face. But as Gregory opened the door to exit, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "We're closer than you think. You can run, but you can't hide. We'll find you." His stomach twisted with a sense of foreboding. He had dealt with enemies before, professionals who knew how to track and eliminate their targets, but this felt personal. Whoever these people were, they weren't playing games. They had been watching him. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The cold wind hit him as soon as he stepped outside, but Gregory didn't flinch. He had been through much worse than this. The key was to stay calm, to stay focused. It wasn't the first time he had been hunted. The CIA had trained him well for situations like this. The difference now was that he was no longer working for the government. He was working alone. He walked briskly down the street, blending in with the evening crowd. He wasn't in any immediate danger, not yet. But he could feel the weight of the message on his shoulders. There was no way he could ignore it. He needed to figure out who was after him, and why. His mind raced as he walked, thinking through the possibilities. Had someone from his past discovered his identity? Someone he had wronged? Someone who had a vendetta? The streets of Brooklyn had changed over the years, but Gregory still knew them like the back of his hand. He made his way toward a small, discreet alleyway where he could think without the prying eyes of the world. He'd be safe there, for now. It wasn't much, but it was familiar. As he entered the alley, he paused, listening. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. He tensed, immediately falling into a defensive stance. The streets weren't always safe, but Gregory was no stranger to danger. He had survived far worse, but as he peered around the corner, he saw no one. The alley remained empty, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. For a moment, he felt his nerves settle, but then he heard it again, soft footsteps, deliberate and slow. Whoever was following him was being careful, deliberately trying to stay out of sight. Gregory's mind clicked into gear, but he didn't turn to face his pursuer just yet. He wasn't sure who it was, but he didn't want to make the first move until he had more information. Just as the footsteps drew nearer, his phone buzzed again. A new message. "You don't remember me, do you, Gregory? I'm not the one you should fear. It's the people behind me." Before Gregory could respond, a shadow darted from the corner of the alley. A figure, dressed in black, lunged toward him with a knife drawn. Gregory's reflexes were instantaneous. He sidestepped, grabbing the assailant's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. The figure was fast, but not fast enough. With a swift motion, Gregory slammed the attacker against the alley wall, pressing his knee into their chest, holding them in place. The figure gasped for air, struggling to break free, but Gregory's grip was ironclad. "Who are you working for?" Gregory growled. "Why are you after me?" The attacker remained silent, their face hidden beneath a mask. The only thing Gregory could see were the eyes, cold, calculating. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just some random thug. This was someone with a purpose. The masked figure struggled beneath Gregory's grip, but it was clear that whoever this person was, they were well trained. Their body tensed and relaxed in a controlled rhythm, trying to slip out of Gregory's hold, but his strength was too much. The cold wall of the alley pressed against the figure's back as Gregory's knee dug deeper into their chest. "Answer me," Gregory growled, his voice low and steady. "Who the hell are you working for?" The figure gasped for air, their breathing labored. But they didn't speak. Their eyes, obscured by the mask, betrayed no emotion, no fear, no anger. Just an eerie calmness. Gregory tightened his grip, his patience running thin. He didn't have time for games. Every moment he wasted was another step closer to his enemies catching up to him. He knew how these things worked. The longer they dragged things out, the more dangerous it became. Suddenly, the figure's body went limp. At first, Gregory thought it was a trick, a ploy to lull him into a false sense of security. But when the person didn't move at all, he quickly released his hold, stepping back to reassess the situation. Was it possible they'd passed out from the pressure? He hadn't expected it to be that easy. Gregory knelt down beside the figure, carefully rolling them onto their back. His instincts kicked in, alert for any signs of a weapon or hidden danger. His gaze swept over the body. But there was nothing unusual. Just a black outfit, nondescript, the kind of clothing someone might wear for stealth. But the mask was peculiar, too professionally made to be a simple disguise. He reached forward to pull it off, when the figure's eyes snapped open. They were quicker than anyone should be under these circumstances. A flash of panic surged through Gregory's chest, but he had already moved. His hands shot forward to grip the masked figure by the collar, slamming their head back against the alley wall once more. "Who are you working for?" he demanded, his voice now growing more desperate. "Tell me. I'm not playing anymore." The figure's lips curled into something resembling a grin, if only for a second. There was no fear in their eyes, no hesitation. Just cold defiance. Then, without warning, the figure shifted again, more violently this time. Their body twisted beneath Gregory's hold, and before he could react, a small, sleek object was shoved into his side, a knife. It wasn't a deep wound, but it was enough to make him wince. Gregory's reaction was instinctive. He shoved the figure back, using all his strength to create distance between them. His hand went to his side where the small blade had cut through his jacket, but the bleeding wasn't severe. It was a sharp sting, but he had learned long ago to keep his head in moments like these. The figure scrambled to their feet, but Gregory was already back on his own. He stepped into a fighting stance, eyes narrowing. He couldn't afford to take them lightly again. They were skilled. This wasn't the first time they'd been in a fight like this. He could see it in the way they moved, how quickly they recovered. They weren't just an assassin, they were someone with a mission, but this time, Gregory wasn't going to wait. Before the figure could close the distance, Gregory lunged. His fist landed with a brutal punch to their ribs, but the figure managed to twist away just in time. The momentum sent Gregory into a spin, but he quickly righted himself, narrowing the gap between them. This was no longer about just self-defense. It was about survival. As the figure recovered from the blow, they reached into their coat. Gregory's heart raced. Was it a weapon? Another knife? A gun? But to his surprise, the figure pulled out a small device. They pressed a button, and before Gregory could fully comprehend what was happening, a blinding flash of light filled the alley. His vision was immediately impaired, and a ringing sound filled his ears. It was a flashbang. Instinctively, Gregory closed his eyes and dropped to the ground, covering his face with his arms. The sound was deafening, and the light was too much to bear. He could hear the figure's footsteps retreating, but the ringing in his ears made it difficult to focus. His senses were scrambled. Disoriented, the seconds felt like hours. Finally, the ringing started to fade. His vision began to clear, but the figure was gone. There was no sign of them anywhere in the alley. Gregory blinked a few times, shaking his head to clear the remaining fog from his mind. Whoever they were, they had gotten away, probably planned it from the start. They weren't trying to kill him, they were trying to wear him down, get him off balance. He stood up slowly, his hand pressed against his side. The knife wound was still there, but it wasn't life-threatening. He'd have to patch it up later. For now, though, his mind was racing. He pulled his phone from his pocket again, but before he could even glance at it, he noticed something strange, a familiar feeling in the pit of his stomach. The sensation that someone was watching him. It was a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. And he didn't need to look around to know that he wasn't alone. Turning quickly, Gregory's eyes scanned the alley. In the distance, near the edge of the street, a dark figure stood watching him. Just standing there, barely visible in the shadows, but watching nonetheless. Gregory's breath slowed. He didn't move. His hand hovered near his weapon, but he didn't draw it just yet. Whoever this person was, they didn't make a move, and that made Gregory all the more cautious. They were testing him, waiting for him to react. Then, as if sensing his awareness, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. Gregory exhaled sharply, his senses still heightened. He was being hunted. And this time, it wasn't just random thugs. This was a coordinated effort. Someone knew him, knew his past, and wanted him dead. With a grim resolve, he set off down the alley, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. Gregory moved quickly through the darkened streets, his every step calculated, his mind whirring with questions. The masked figure had been skilled, too skilled, and their tactics had been deliberate. Whoever was behind this, they knew what they were doing. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that he was just one piece in a much larger game. He reached a street corner and paused, his senses on high alert. The city was alive with noise, the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shout from an alleyway or bar. But despite the activity, Gregory felt as though he was being hunted. He had always been good at blending in, slipping through the cracks. But tonight, something felt different. His instincts told him that someone, somewhere, was tracking his every move. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The message from earlier burned in his mind: "We're closer than you think." Whoever these people were, they had to be professionals. But how had they found him? He'd been careful, too careful. He'd left no traces of his past life, no hint that he had once been a CIA agent. Or had he? Gregory's fingers hovered over the screen, and he scrolled through the messages he'd received. But there was nothing new. No new information, no new threats. Just the lingering sense that he was being watched. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, signaling the approaching storm. Gregory's jaw tightened. He didn't have time to wait around. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The sudden sound of footsteps behind him snapped Gregory's focus back to the present. His body tensed instinctively. He didn't need to turn around to know that someone was tailing him. The pace was steady, calculated. Not hurried, but not relaxed either. Whoever it was trying to stay hidden, trying to remain unnoticed. Gregory's hand slid inside his jacket, his fingers curling around the grip of his concealed weapon. He didn't know if he was being followed by another assassin or just some street thug looking for trouble, but he couldn't afford to take any chances. He kept walking, his steps measured, as he searched for a way to lose his tail. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the night in his head. The flashbang, the masked figure, the sudden disappearance. This wasn't random. It was too coordinated, too deliberate. Someone had planned all of this. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that whoever had sent these people after him had a deep understanding of his past, of the skills he possessed. With a quick glance over his shoulder, Gregory spotted a man in a dark jacket trailing behind him. The man's face was partially obscured by the collar of his jacket, but his posture was stiff, his walk purposeful. Gregory's eyes narrowed. He didn't hesitate. He turned sharply into the next alley, quickening his pace as he moved through the shadows. He needed to find a way to get the upper hand. The man trailing him wasn't just following for no reason, he was either looking for a confrontation or hoping Gregory would lead him to something more. Gregory's mind raced with options. He could lead the man into a trap, lure him into a narrow section of the alley where he could engage him in close combat. Or he could confront him outright and force the man to tell him who he was working for. Either way, he wasn't going to wait around and be ambushed. As he turned the corner, he paused for a moment, listening carefully. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. He took a deep breath, and when the man came into view, Gregory moved with lightning speed, grabbing him from behind and slamming him into the alley wall. The man let out a surprised grunt, but before he could react, Gregory twisted his arm behind his back, holding him in place. "Who are you?" Gregory growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Why are you following me?" The man struggled briefly, but he was caught off guard by Gregory's strength and precision. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked gasp. His free hand went to his jacket, fumbling for something, but Gregory was quicker. He slammed the man's hand to the wall. Pinning it there. "Tell me who you're working for," Gregory demanded again, his patience wearing thin. The alley was dim, but Gregory's sharp eyes caught the glint of something small in the man's hand. A small communication device. He knew immediately that this wasn't just a street thug. The device was too clean, too sophisticated. This man was part of the same group that had been hunting him. The man let out a strained laugh. You really don't get it, do you? His voice was raspy, but there was a strange calmness to it. They've been watching you for a long time, Gregory. They've been waiting. Gregory's grip tightened, but the man didn't seem to care. His word struck a nerve. Waiting for what? Gregory hissed. Who the hell are they? The man's lips curled into a cold smile. You think you're in control? You have no idea. They've got people everywhere, Gregory. They've been tracking you for years. They know everything about you, everything. The man's words hit Gregory like a slap to the face. He had been careful. He had kept his past hidden. But somehow, someone had found out. Someone had discovered the truth. It didn't make sense, but the man's confidence suggested that this wasn't just a random encounter. This was the start of something much bigger. Before Gregory could demand more answers, the man's eyes flicked toward the entrance of the alley. His expression shifted from calm to alert, and Gregory's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming. Without warning, the man slipped from Gregory's grasp, pulling away with surprising speed. Gregory's instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward, but it was too late. The man was already out of reach, and as Gregory turned to face the street, he saw the headlights of a car approaching fast. The car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley, and two figures stepped out, one tall, the other shorter, both wearing dark clothing. Gregory's heart sank. More enemies. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. The man from the alley turned toward Gregory with a mocking grin. You can't run from this. Gregory. It's already too late. They've got eyes on you everywhere now. You're already in their sights. Gregory's grip on his weapon tightened, his jaw clenching. This was just the beginning, and he was about to be thrust back into a world he thought he had left behind. But this time, he was ready. The sound of the car's tires screeching to a halt echoed through the narrow alley as the two figures approached. They moved like shadows, precise and deliberate. Gregory didn't waste any time. His mind was already working through the options, evaluating the situation. The man who had just escaped had clearly been part of something much larger, and now these two new players had entered the game. The odds were against him, but Gregory had survived worse. Much worse. He was already positioned at the mouth of the alley, his back against the wall, his fingers gripping the concealed weapon at his side. His breathing was steady, his heart beating in a controlled rhythm. He had no choice but to confront these new arrivals head-on. The two figures stopped about 10 feet away, their eyes scanning the alley, the dim glow from the streetlights casting harsh shadows over their faces. They were professionals, no doubt about it. Gregory could tell by the way they carried themselves, the ease with which they moved, the fluidity of their steps. These weren't just random thugs. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing. Gregory, I presume. The taller of the two spoke first, his voice smooth, calculated, and far too confident. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Gregory with a cold, calculating gaze. His partner, the shorter one, said nothing. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for something. Gregory didn't respond immediately. He studied them both, trying to assess the threat. The taller man was dressed in a dark suit, impeccably tailored, his shoes polished to a gleam. The shorter one was wearing a tactical vest over a plain black shirt, his eyes sharp and focused. There was no doubt these two were part of a larger operation, and their appearance alone screamed that they were far from amateurs. You know, the taller man continued, his grin widening slightly, I've heard a lot about you. It's not often we find someone with your skill set. The kind of people who attract attention like you do tend to leave a trail. He tilted his head, watching Gregory closely. But I suppose you're used to that. Aren't you? Gregory remained silent. He was calculating the odds now, measuring his options. The alley was narrow, not ideal for a fight, but it had a few advantages. The walls were close enough that he could use them to his advantage, if things came to blows. His best bet, however, was to avoid the confrontation altogether. He needed more information. Not much for conversation. The man asked with a raised eyebrow. That's fine. I didn't come here to chat. Gregory's eyes flicked toward the shorter figure, who had been studying him with unnerving focus. The man didn't seem to have any weapons visible, but Gregory knew better than to trust appearances. He was just as dangerous as the taller one. "We're not here to kill you, Gregory," the taller man said suddenly, his tone more serious now. "At least, not yet. You've got a lot of enemies, and we're just, well, let's call it, your first stop." Gregory narrowed his eyes. His instincts screamed at him to stay calm. This was a game. A dangerous game. But what was the end goal? Why were they after him now? First stop for what? Gregory's voice was low, controlled. His fingers hovered over his weapon, but he didn't draw it yet. He couldn't afford to make a move unless he had all the pieces. The taller man chuckled, a low, dark sound that sent a shiver down Gregory's spine. "You're a smart guy. But I think you're missing the bigger picture. You've got a history, Gregory. One that's been buried, until now. And unfortunately, when things from the past resurface, well, let's just say, people take notice." The taller man waved his hand in the air dismissively, as if brushing away some insignificant detail. "We've been hired to bring you in, Gregory. It's time to pay your debts." "Debts?" Gregory repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I'm not in debt to anyone." The man smiled again, his lips curling into a tight, humorless grin. "You might not think so. But someone else does. And they've got the resources to make you regret that you ever crossed them." Gregory's mind raced. He knew enough about how the world worked to understand that a job like this wouldn't come cheap. Someone, somewhere, with a lot of power, had sent these people after him. They weren't after money. They were after something far more dangerous. Something about his past had caught their attention, and now they were closing in on him. "I don't have time for games," Gregory said, his voice now colder, harder. "If you've got a job to do, do it. If not, get the hell out of my way." The shorter man finally spoke, his voice rough, like gravel grinding against metal. "You think you can just walk away from this? It doesn't work like that. You've got two choices, Gregory. You can come with us, quietly, or we can make you come with us." Gregory's fingers tightened around his weapon. He wasn't going down without a fight. If it came to it, he'd take them both down, but as the words left the shorter man's mouth, the air suddenly shifted. A loud noise broke the tension, gunfire. The sharp crack of a shot rang out from behind Gregory, followed by the sound of the taller man grunting in pain. In the blink of an eye, Gregory spun around, his weapon already drawn. He saw the shooter standing at the far end of the alley, a silhouette in the dim light. The figure fired again, but Gregory was faster. He dove behind a stack of crates, narrowly avoiding the second bullet as it zipped past him. "Who the hell are you?" Gregory shouted over the noise, his heart racing. The shooter didn't respond. Instead, he fired again, this time aimed directly at the shorter man. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a howl of pain. The taller man, now doubled over in pain from the first shot, staggered back toward the car. "This isn't over, Gregory," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "This is just the beginning. You can't run forever." Gregory didn't wait for him to finish. He rushed toward the car, his gun drawn, but the shooter disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing into the shadows. The alley was eerily silent now, save for the sound of the wind howling through the empty street. Gregory stood there for a moment, catching his breath. He didn't know who had just saved him, but whoever they were. They had just thrown a wrench into his enemy's plans. His pulse was still racing, his mind spinning. There was no time to waste. He had to move quickly. Whoever had just shot at him was on his side, for now. But the real question was, how long would that last? Gregory's breath came in ragged bursts as he stepped cautiously into the dimly lit street. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still surging through his veins from the chaos that had unfolded in the alley just moments before. The taller man was still alive, albeit injured, and had retreated with his wounded partner into the black car. They would be back. They weren't the type to back down so easily. The gunshot that had saved Gregory was a mystery, a welcome one, but still a mystery. The shooter hadn't given any indication of who they were, only making their presence known in the most efficient way possible, a precise shot that had disrupted the enemy's operation. But they were gone as quickly as they had appeared. The alley was empty now, save for the two wounded men. Gregory's mind was still racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. He couldn't afford to let the confusion overwhelm him. The fact that someone had tried to kill him tonight wasn't the real question. The real question was why. Why was someone willing to pay so much money to take him down? What about his past could possibly be worth all of this? He didn't have time to dwell on it. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, but just before he unlocked it, a noise broke the silence, a faint rustle of movement from behind a dumpster nearby. Gregory's reflexes kicked in instantly. He was on high alert again, eyes scanning the shadows. Searching for the source of the sound. Who's there? Gregory called out, his voice low and steady. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the figure emerged, a man, tall and lean, dressed in black, his features obscured by the shadows. He stepped forward with a calm, deliberate pace, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "But we need to talk." Gregory's fingers twitched at his side. He had been through enough tonight to know better than to trust anyone who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of an alley. But there was something different about this guy. He wasn't acting like the others. "Talk about what?" Gregory asked, still wary. His gun stayed in his hand, but he kept it pointed at the ground for now. The man's eyes flicked to the gun, then back to Gregory's face. He didn't seem fazed by the weapon, nor by the tension that hung thick in the air. "About what's coming next," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Gregory narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just a random encounter. He had a feeling this man knew something important. But was he an ally, or another player in the game trying to manipulate him? "I don't need any more surprises," Gregory said, his voice low. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to consider his words carefully before speaking again. "My name's Elias," he said. "I work with people who are interested in your particular skill set." "People?" Gregory raised an eyebrow. "What people?" Elias sighed, as if the question was obvious. "People who don't want you dead. People who want to make use of you. But they can't do that if you're dead, can they?" Gregory remained silent, studying Elias. His tone wasn't threatening, but there was something underlying it that made Gregory's instincts scream that he couldn't trust this guy just yet. "I don't work for anyone," Gregory said firmly, his jaw clenched. "Not anymore." Elias gave a short laugh, a sound without humor. "You're still thinking like a free man. But the world doesn't work that way. Not anymore. And if you want to survive this, you're going to need allies. You won't be able to do it alone." Gregory's grip on his gun tightened. He wasn't so sure about this whole allies thing. The last time he'd trusted someone, things had gone sideways quickly. But Elias wasn't just another thug in the street, he had to know something Gregory didn't. "I've already got enemies," Gregory muttered. "I don't need any more." Elias stepped closer, keeping his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. "You're going to have to make some choices, Gregory. And soon. The people after you are bigger than you realize. And you've got something they want. You've always had something they want." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Something they want. What could he possibly have that was worth all this trouble? His mind raced again, but before he could ask, Elias spoke once more. "Those people tonight. The ones who sent the two thugs. They're part of a larger organization, one that's been keeping tabs on you for a long time. And now they're ready to move." Gregory's heart skipped a beat. Keeping tabs on him? Who the hell were these people? Elias must have seen the confusion in his eyes, because he continued. "They know who you are, Gregory. They know what you did. And now they're coming to collect." The cold weight of Elias's words sank into Gregory's chest. For years, he had buried his past. He had walked away from the life he once knew, leaving it all behind. He had tried to live a normal life, far removed from the covert operations, the secrets, the bloodshed. But it seemed that his past was determined to find him, no matter how far he ran. "Who are they?" Gregory asked, his voice tight with urgency. "What do they want from me?" Elias hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "They want what you know. They want your connections. Your knowledge. They want the access you have, the access you used to have." Gregory's mind whirled. His connections. His knowledge. There was no way they could know about all that. He had severed ties with everyone. Cut himself off completely. There was no one left who knew the secrets of his past, and yet. Elias was telling him something different. The CIA. Gregory whispered the words, though they felt strange on his tongue. Elias nodded slowly, his eyes unwavering. "Yes. The CIA. And the people you used to work for. They've been watching you. They've been waiting. And now, they've decided it's time to bring you back in. The weight of those words hit Gregory with the force of a freight train. He hadn't been able to outrun his past. He had never really escaped. The people who had trained him, who had used him, they were still out there, and they were still pulling the strings. Gregory's mind was already racing. He had been too complacent, too naive. His time on the run had made him weak. But now he had a choice to make. He took a deep breath, his mind settling into a grim resolve. The game had changed. And he would need to change with it, so, what's next? Gregory asked, his voice low, but steady. Do you want to use me too? Elias's eyes flickered with a knowing smile. No, Gregory. I'm here to help you. If you're willing to listen. Gregory knew that, for the first time in years, he had no other choice. As the dust settles and the final shots echo in the night, Gregory stands victorious, but at what cost? The enemies he faced were only the beginning, and the mysterious forces that wanted him gone are far from finished. With his past now fully intertwined with his present, Gregory is forced to make difficult decisions about who he can trust, what he's willing to sacrifice, and how far he's willing to go to protect what's left of his life. In a breathtaking twist, everything Gregory fought for is challenged, and the true depth of the conspiracy behind him is revealed. The battle is over, for now, but the war is just beginning. Hope you enjoyed this wild ride. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more epic stories like this. Stay tuned, there's much more action ahead.